There's a faith in it. Yeah. It's like a faithfulness to authenticity, truthfulness, genuine. This sort of movement where all of the self turns towards one's own life. There's nothing being held back in the sort of deceitfulness that you mentioned before. There's no side room in which a part of me is maintaining an objective view, or there's no closet with dead bodies in it anymore, right? There's a sense that no, I'm opening all the doors. Everything in my life is fair game, right? And I started, saying those kinds of prayers.
Yes.
A couple of years ago of I don't care what it costs me anymore. I genuinely don't. I'm like, I don't understand what's going on fundamentally, like, about anything, right? But like, I'm here for whatever it is, and my orientation is to allow myself to change such that I fit in it with an optimal grip.
What brought you to that place?
Well, personally, I mean, so there were a few things. I mean, one of them is that, the character flaw aspect that I talked about earlier. Like, for me, it was pornography. And it was, it wasn't as if I didn't get caught or have some great disaster because of it. It was just that I knew it was hurting me, and I had gone down every route I could to get rid of it in joining men's groups and every blocker on the computer, all that stuff, right? And it was still part of my life. And I got to a point where I said, anything can go as long as my life gets better, because I don't like how this is now. So that was part of it. The other part was 12 Rules for Life, and especially the chapter of Tell the Truth, or at least Don't Lie. Like, I think that all I just said is in that chapter. I think that's how Jordan would understand it. And I think that's what Jordan does. I think that's why Jordan is so unbelievably powerful. Is he's a brilliant mind with a lot of training and a lot of rigorous integration of all of himself across every domain. And again, he's still a person. He's not perfect, but it allows him to channel something that is profound. And it's that, it's that sense of resonance that you can't fake, and that you can't, like when you have the interactions with people, when they're all there, and they're not, that they're not holding parts of themselves in rooms that you can't see. And I think that spirit is what ties us all together in this little corner, and fosters these sorts of movements that we're talking about.
Man, I love that. I remember the in some of Peterson's early conversations, and you want to talk about prayer? I'll tell you a prayer. Ask God what you've done wrong. You'll get an answer. So for me, I was unfaithful to my wife. I was a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And to get to that kind of place, you have to have secret corners and secret closets and skeletons. And and I remember, even after being fired and that coming to light, I still had pieces that I was not telling the truth. And I would pray to God. And then, for that time I was separated, and I would pray to God, what should I do? And immediately I could feel myself to try to say, nobody's around, the full truth. And I would have to like put my hands over my mouth because it was too scary. Because like when you talked about there being like, I hadn't gotten to that point, to that desperate enough place, unfortunately, to say there's nothing, whatever brought you to the place to say nothing's off limits. I still had a limit. And that's when I talked about Abraham and the idea of putting that thing, which I thought was going to, which, you know, it might, would have, and could have, and maybe it even did, my family and my marriage up on the altar. And I had this vision, Abraham's dagger is coming down. And I was willing to trust that the truth was better somehow. Just how Abraham, I don't know how makes sense. Why this doesn't make, this has never, because it had never made sense to me. That being honest about that part of my life would make things better. I thought, no, I need to be better or look better or act better, but not be honest about this.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, when you shared that, and I've talked about that on this channel, but it's just, that's why I was curious. And whenever, you know, when you said pornography, and I'm just like, oh shit. Yeah. And just this, why does this make sense? And why this, you know, why this, far right extremist Jordan Peterson, what, you know, like,
yeah.
What is all this? And like you said, they, well, he's helped exorcise some demons, and maybe because he had to exorcise them in himself or whatever. And now it's so strange because we're, you know, 7-8 years out from that moment, that cultural moment. And so many of us were shaken awake, or we had been, and we're like trying to kind of like crawl, you know, and now some of us maybe are walking, and we're like trying to, and maybe climbing, you know, to, that maybe, I mean, because when you talked about the logoi or something like this, I think this is what I came on here to do, was to think out loud about these things.
Yeah.
And to continue to testify to something that's true.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And
You too.
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear about the particular, like if you're willing to be a little bit more fine grained about the experience with Abraham, because that's, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with Kierkegaard, but Kierkegaard's book Fear and Trembling had a huge impact on me, which is, and that's all pretty much all it's about. And so
yeah,
that story's big for me already. And I'm really, yeah, that's a powerful moment. Obviously it's huge for you.
So like I said, you know, things had been fired, things had been, you know, come to light. And but I was still holding on to a narrative that I thought and agreed to that wasn't as bad as I, you know, again, and that was always the pattern. That was always men's group. You talk about like, oh, I did this X amount of times. Yeah, I did this. Not the actual X, you know, like just, it was just like a constant. And so and so, yeah, that's where I still was there. You know, you have this, you think this is the time that time to wise up, but I was still too afraid of the truth. And of course my wife we're trying to talk through, what are we going to do? And we're on the phone, and she, you know, of course she's asking me all sorts of questions that I don't want to answer. And she asked me another one, and I knew it, and I lied. And she said, Christian, if you're lying to me, it's going to continue to find you out. But if you tell me the truth, I will meet you at the truth. And I said, do you promise? And she said, yes. So I hung up the phone and I basically curled up like a baby in the fetal position, fear and quaking, like, I mean, afraid of the truth, afraid of who I was. And it was in that moment that I had the story rise up into my mind. You know, people use lots of different words for the Holy Spirit showed me, or I don't have words other than that. It in a very quick moment, this idea of a dagger coming down, and what I felt in that moment was, if I believe this, then I'm going to believe that the truth is that somehow the truth, to trust God with the truth is somehow better, even though I can't imagine that it is. Like I didn't have a category for that it being, but it all, like that story of Abraham and Isaac made it like crystallized in a moment for me. And of course, as a kid, you know, you can have all these other ideas about why, and well, you know, this is, you can extrapolate out to, this is God's relationship with man. This is, you know, Christ, he could have raised him from the dead, you know, God provide, and all these things. But in that moment, it was just, am I willing to let the dagger or start to let the dagger come down in an act of trust? And so I sat up and I typed out a confession and I sent it to my wife on a messenger. Unfortunately, well, it's not unfortunate. I sent it to my associate pastor at the church because I was the last person I was talking to. And I was just like, well, copy, paste, send again. And just because
Wow.
And, you know, things were much more difficult before they got better. But that began the process of true metanoia. That began a process of of being able to reconcile in truth and began to, be able to build, you know, and I had all sorts of questions about my faith. I had all sorts of questions, but I think that what feels right is something like, you know, when it says the wise man built his house on the rock and the wise man or versus the sand. I don't think I built on sand, but I don't think I built a good house. I think that the rock was still there. That was all that was there. So, and
man,
and so that's, and you know, like I said, the timeline was 2016, like late 2016,
and was the story of Abraham and Isaac already important to you?
Not in more or less important than any other story that I knew. I was the kid at Sunday school, you know. I'm sure,
of course, yeah. But
I knew all the stories.
Wow.
So it just,
man, whoa, whew, man. First of all, I know that feeling. I think any of us that have been in those sorts of places have found that sort of, have sat with ourselves and truly come to that place of know that feeling. And I think that is probably the most powerful and clear like incarnation of that story, right? Like that's yeah. But also like you said, you can get all sorts of really interesting interpretations of things, but until you live them, it's just not the same.
yeah. And the thing about that is it's a practice. It's a discipline. And it's better to begin to exercise and practice that discipline before, you know, before things that can be painful, can not only be painful but be destructive.
Hmm.